They told me to cut my tree, or they'd start taking my money. So I let them. Not because I agreed with them, not even close, but because I already knew something they didn't, and by the time they figured it out, it was way too late to undo anything. See, this wasn't just any tree sitting in my front yard. This thing had been standing there longer than this entire neighborhood had even existed, longer than the roads, the sidewalks, probably longer than the idea of the town itself. And somehow, a handful of people on a homeowner's board thought they could just decide its fate over a Tuesday evening meeting with bad coffee and a clipboard. I live in a quiet neighborhood just outside a small city in Northern California, the kind of place where everything looks picture perfect at first glance, trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes, that sort of thing. But if you stay long enough, you start to notice the tension underneath, the subtle politics, the way certain people carry themselves like they own not just their property, but yours too, and that's where the HOA comes in. Now I knew what I was getting into when I bought the place. Everyone tells you about HOAs, the rules, the fees, the occasional headache. But what they don't tell you is how personal it can get when someone decides they don't like you or something you have. For me, that something was the tree. A massive valley oak right in my front yard, trunk so wide it would take 3 grown adults holding hands to wrap around it, branches stretching out like they own the sky, casting this wide, cool shade across the street every afternoon. I remember the first time I saw it. I didn't even care about the house. I stood there looking up through the canopy thinking, yeah, this is it. This is where I'm staying. The previous owner told me the tree had been there for centuries, and I believed him. You could feel it just standing near it, like it had seen things, weathered things, outlived generations without asking permission from anyone. For the first few months, everything was fine. Neighbors waved. People walked their dogs past the house. Some even stopped to admire the tree. There was this older guy named Walter from 2 houses down who used to tell me stories about how kids used to play under it decades ago, back when the street wasn't even paved yet, but not everyone saw it that way. About 3 months in, I got my first letter from the HOA, nothing too aggressive at first, just a notice saying the tree needed maintenance because some branches extended over the sidewalk. I figured, all right, maybe a light trim, keep things tidy, no big deal. Then I met Diane. She was the HOA president, mid-50s, always dressed like she had somewhere more important to be, even when she didn't. And she had this way of talking that wasn't loud, but it cut through you anyway, like she'd already decided she was right before you even opened your mouth. She showed up at my door one afternoon with a clipboard tucked under her arm and a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She didn't waste time with small talk, just pointed at the tree and said, "That needs to be cut back. It's interfering with community property." I remember leaning against the doorframe, looking past her at the tree, then back at her, and saying, "Cut back how much?" She flipped a page on her clipboard and said, 15 feet on all sides. Within 30 days. I actually laughed a little at that, not because it was funny, but because it sounded insane, like she was talking about trimming a hedge, not a living thing that size. "You cut that much off a tree like this," I said. "You don't maintain it, you kill it." She didn't even blink. "Then remove it." Just like that. No hesitation, no second thought, like she was suggesting I repaint a fence or replace a mailbox. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about safety or sidewalks or leaves. This was about control. I told her no, plain and simple, and she gave me that same tight smile again, scribbled something on her clipboard, and said, "Then you'll be fined. Daily, if necessary." The first fine came a week later, $300. I paid it, not because I agreed, but because I wasn't ready to make my move yet. Then came $600, then $1,200. Each notice more aggressive than the last. Each one signed off with Diane's name like a stamp of authority she was enjoying a little too much. Neighbors started to notice too. A couple of them stopped me while I was out front, asking what was going on. Some were sympathetic, others kept their distance, like they didn't want to get on the wrong side of the board. One evening, I was raking leaves, just doing my usual thing, when Walter walked over and stood beside me, watching the branches sway a little in the wind. He shook his head and said, "They've been wanting that tree gone for years. You just happen to be the one standing in the way now." That stuck with me, because it meant this wasn't new. This wasn't just about me refusing to comply. This was something they'd been building toward, and now they thought they finally had their chance. I nodded, kept raking, and said, "Yeah, well, they picked the wrong guy. What they didn't know was that while they were busy sending fines and notices, I'd already started making a few calls, quiet ones, the kind you make when you're not looking to argue, you're looking to win. I reached out to a county arborist, a guy named Michael Torres, someone who actually understood trees, not just how they looked, but what they meant, what they were worth beyond aesthetics or convenience. When I told him about the tree, there was a pause on the line. Then he said, "Send me pictures." I did. And the next day, he called me back, and his tone had changed, more serious now. "I'm coming out to take a look," he said. "Don't let anyone touch that tree until I get there." That's when I knew this wasn't going to end the way Diane thought it would. Michael showed up 2 days later in an old county truck that looked like it had seen more dirt roads than pavement, stepped out with this calm, unhurried energy, like a guy who didn't get impressed easily. But the moment he saw the tree, he just stopped. Didn't say anything for a few seconds, just tilted his head back, eyes tracing the canopy, then walked slowly around the trunk, one hand brushing against the bark like he was greeting something old and familiar. "You weren't exaggerating," he finally said, almost under his breath, and I remember feeling this small, quiet sense of relief, like someone else finally understood what I'd been trying to protect. He spent the entire afternoon there, measuring the diameter, checking the soil, taking core samples with this long, narrow tool that pulled out a thin strip of wood from deep inside the trunk, and every so often, he'd stop, look at the rings, and just nod to himself. I stayed out of his way mostly, watched from the porch, but near the end I walked over and asked him straight, "So, how bad is it?" He looked up at me, almost confused by the question, then gave a small smile. "Bad," he said. "This tree is in better shape than most things planted 50 years ago. Structurally sound, no major decay, good canopy balance. Whoever told you to cut this back 15 feet either doesn't know what they're talking about, or they don't care if it dies." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "And the age?" I asked. He tapped the sample lightly. "I'll confirm it in the lab, but just from what I'm seeing, you're looking at over 300 years. Easy." That was the moment everything shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but like a lock clicking into place. Because I already knew about the county's heritage tree ordinance. I'd looked it up after the second fine came in, but hearing him say that number out loud made it real, made it actionable. Trees over 200 years old could be designated as protected landmarks. And once that happened, no trimming, no removal, no disturbance without county approval. I asked him, "If I apply for that, do you think it qualifies?" He didn't hesitate. I'd be surprised if it didn't. The next few days were paperwork, forms, documentation, photos, reports, not exciting, not dramatic, but necessary, like setting up pieces on a board before a game no one else realizes is already in motion. Michael submitted his evaluation, backed it with everything he had, and I filed the application with the county. And then, I waited. Meanwhile, the HOA didn't. The fines kept coming, escalating like clockwork, and Diane made sure I felt the pressure. She showed up again one morning while I was out front, this time without the fake smile. "You're out of compliance," she said flatly. "You're now subject to cumulative penalties." I wiped my hands on my jeans, looked at her, and said, "I'm aware." She glanced at the tree, then back at me. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I almost laughed again, but this time I held it in. "No," I said, "I think you are." That didn't sit well with her. You could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the way she adjusted her grip on that clipboard like it was the only thing keeping her in control. "We have plans for this neighborhood," she said, and that was the first time she'd said something that actually gave me a glimpse into what this was really about. "What kind of plans?" I asked. She hesitated, just for a second, then said, "Improvements. Expansion. Things that benefit everyone." I nodded slowly, like I was considering it, but inside, something clicked again. Because now it wasn't just about a tree, it was about whatever those plans were, and how that tree stood in the way. "Sounds expensive," I said. She gave a short, tight smile. "It's already in motion." And then she left. That conversation stuck with me more than the fines, more than the notices, because it confirmed what Walter had hinted at. They wanted the tree gone for a reason, not just because it dropped leaves or cracked concrete, but because it was inconvenient to something bigger. About 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the county. Official, stamped, the kind you open a little slower than usual. I stood there in the kitchen, Sunlight coming in through the window, the tree's shadow stretching across the floor, and I read it once, then again, just to be sure. The tree had been approved as a designated heritage landmark. 340 years old, officially recognized, permanently protected. I didn't celebrate, not outwardly, didn't call anyone or make a big deal out of it. I just walked outside, stood under the branches, and looked up for a while. There's something about knowing you did right by something that can't speak for itself. It sits differently than winning an argument. But the real impact of that letter didn't hit until a few days later, when I saw survey flags going up along the street. Bright orange markers stuck into the ground, lining the curb, stretching past my house and down the block. I watched from the porch as a couple of contractors walked around with clipboards, measuring distances, talking quietly to each other. One of them glanced at the tree, then said something I couldn't hear, and the other one just shook his head. That's when it started coming together. I walked down the street later that afternoon and ran into one of my neighbors, a woman named Carla who tended to know everything before anyone else did. I nodded toward the flags and asked, "What's all this?" She leaned in a little, lowering her voice like it was gossip. "They're widening the street," she said, "adding guest parking along this side. HOA approved it last month." I felt that slow, familiar click again. "And they didn't mention that to me," I said. She gave me a look, half sympathy, half curiosity. "Well, your tree's kind of in the way." "Yeah," I figured. Over the next few days, more details surfaced. Contracts had been signed, permits were in process, and the HOA had already put down a $20,000 non-refundable deposit to start construction. This wasn't just an idea, it was already moving forward. Or at least, it had been. Because what they either didn't realize or chose to ignore was that the designated protection didn't just cover the visible part of the tree. It extended underground to what's called the critical root zone, a radius around the tree where any digging, any disturbance, required a full review and mitigation plan approved by the county. And that radius overlapped directly with where they planned to tear up the street. I didn't have to say anything. I didn't have to confront anyone or wave the letter around or make a scene. I just sent a copy of the designation to the county office handling the construction permits, along with Michael's report, and let the system do what it was designed to do. A week later, the contractors were gone. The flags disappeared, and word started spreading. I didn't hear it from Diane first. I heard it from Walter, who walked up to me one morning with this slow grin on his face like he already knew how the story ended. "They pulled the project," he said. "County shut it down." I leaned on the rake, tried to keep my expression neutral, but I could feel it creeping in anyway. "That's so." He nodded. "Something about the tree, protected zone, they can't dig within 50 feet without a whole mitigation plan. And even then, it's not guaranteed." I looked past him at the street, quiet again, untouched. "And the deposit?" I asked. Walter let out a low whistle. "Gone." That was the first real moment of payoff. Not loud, not dramatic. Just this quiet realization that everything Diane had been pushing toward had just collapsed under its own weight. And the thing she tried to get rid of was the exact reason why. Of course, she didn't take it well. She showed up at my door again. But this time there was no clipboard, no attempt at professionalism. Just frustration barely held together. "You knew," she said the moment I opened the door. I shrugged slightly. "Knew what?" Her eyes narrowed. "Don't play dumb. You knew about the designation, about the impact it would have on the project." I leaned against the frame again, same spot as before. "I followed the law," I said. "That's all." She took a step closer. "You weaponized it." That word hung there for a second, heavier than the rest. I thought about it, really thought about it, then shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I protected something that was already here. You just didn't plan around it." She stared at me like she wanted to argue more, like she had a whole speech ready. But for once, she didn't have the leverage anymore. And I think she knew it. After that conversation, things didn't explode all at once. They unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled loose that no one could quite grab onto anymore. The neighborhood felt different, not louder, not openly hostile, but quieter in a way that carried tension, like people were watching something play out but weren't sure which side they were supposed to be on. Some neighbors started talking to me more than before, stopping by when I was out front, asking questions they pretended were casual. "So the tree's protected now? They really can't touch it?" And I'd just nod, keep it simple, because the truth was, this had gone way beyond a tree at that point. It was about control, about who gets to decide what stays and what goes, and what happens when someone pushes back and doesn't fold. Diane didn't come around for a couple of weeks after that last confrontation, but that didn't mean she was done. People like her don't just walk away when something slips out of their grip, they regroup. And sure enough, the next move came in the form of a letter, not just to me, but to the entire neighborhood. Official HOA letterhead, carefully worded, painting the canceled project as a missed opportunity for community enhancement, and without naming me directly, making it very clear who was responsible. You could read between the lines if you knew what you were looking for, phrases like individual actions and uncooperative property owners, and financial setbacks affecting all residents. It was subtle, but intentional, the kind of thing designed to turn people against you without ever saying your name out loud. A couple days later, I started noticing the shift. Not everyone, but enough. Fewer waves from certain houses, conversations that stopped when I walked by, that kind of thing. And honestly, I understood it. From their perspective, they were being told they lost something that would have made their lives easier, more convenient, and now they might have to pay for it too. That's the part people don't talk about with these situations. Doing the right thing doesn't always make you popular. Sometimes it just makes you the easiest person to blame. Then came the lawsuit. I got served on a Thursday afternoon, standing right there on my porch under the same tree. All of this started over. The guy handed me the papers, gave a quick, "You've been served," and walked off like it was just another delivery. I stood there for a minute, flipping through it, reading phrases like intentional interference, financial damages, sabotage of community development, and I'll admit, for a second, it hit me. Not fear exactly, but that weight you feel when something that was already complicated suddenly becomes official, legal, harder to just brush off. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread out in front of me, the house quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I thought about everything that had led up to this, every fine I paid, every conversation, every step I took, and I asked myself, just once, if I would have done anything differently. And the answer came quick, almost automatic no. Because at the end of the day, I didn't create the situation. I just refused to let them bulldoze through it. I hired a lawyer the next morning. Not someone flashy, not the kind of guy who talks in big dramatic statements. Just a steady, sharp attorney named Greg who had handled property disputes before. He read through the case, leaned back in his chair, and let out a small breath through his nose like he'd seen this kind of thing more times than he could count. "They're reaching," he said. "You didn't break any laws, you followed them." I asked him straight, "So what happens now?" He shrugged slightly. "Now, we let them try to prove something that isn't there." The hearing itself wasn't anything like you see in movies, no shouting, no dramatic objections, just a small courtroom, a judge who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and two sides telling very different versions of the same story. The HOA's attorney tried to frame it like I'd manipulated the system, that I'd intentionally timed the landmark designation to block a project that was already underway, that I'd caused financial harm to the community out of spite or stubbornness. And I sat there listening, hands folded, not reacting, because none of that mattered if it couldn't be backed by something real. When it was our turn, Greg kept it simple. He laid out the timeline, the condition of the tree, the county's ordinance, the independent evaluation, no theatrics, just facts. He emphasized one point more than anything else, that heritage protection wasn't a loophole, it was a legal right, and one that existed long before any development plans. My client didn't sabotage anything, he said. He complied with the law, and the law protected what was already there. The judge listened, flipped through the documents, asked a couple of clarifying questions, and then, in a moment that honestly felt almost anticlimactic, he shook his head slightly and said, "This doesn't hold." Not loudly, not dramatically, just matter of fact, like he was closing a file he'd already made up his mind about. He dismissed the case right there, stated clearly that protecting a designated heritage tree was within my rights as a property owner, and that any financial loss the HOA suffered was a result of their own planning decisions, not my actions. That was it. Months of tension, fines, threats, all leading to that one quiet decision. But the aftermath, that's where things really settled in. The HOA didn't just lose the case, they lost money. A lot of it. Legal fees piled up fast, somewhere around $45,000 by the time everything was done. And since HOAs don't just absorb costs like that, it got passed down. A special assessment split across every homeowner in the neighborhood. People who hadn't cared one way or another before suddenly had a number attached to the situation. And numbers change how people feel real quick. I noticed the shift again, but this time, it was different. The quiet tension wasn't aimed at me anymore. Conversations started picking up again, neighbors stopping by, some of them more direct now. One guy even laughed a little and said, "Guess they should have checked the rules first." Walter just shook his head one afternoon and muttered, "Tried to outsmart a tree, didn't work out too well." And Diane, well, she didn't stick around much longer after that. About 2 months later, a for sale sign went up in front of her house. No big announcement, no explanation, just quiet, like she was trying to leave the whole thing behind without drawing attention to it. I saw her once during that time, loading boxes into the back of her car. We didn't talk. We just nodded at each other, brief, neutral, like two people who had already said everything they needed to say. As for me, I'm still here. Same house, same street, same tree standing exactly where it's always been, roots deep, branches stretching out like they don't care about any of this human back and forth. Sometimes I sit out on the porch in the late afternoon, watch the light filter through the leaves, listen to the wind move through it, and I think about how close it came to being cut down over something as temporary as a parking expansion. Every fall, the leaves come down just like they always have, covering the yard, drifting onto the sidewalk, into the street, and yeah, I rake them. I pile them up, take care of my space. But I won't lie, sometimes I let a few extra sit out there a little longer than necessary. Just enough to remind anyone paying attention that the tree's still here, and it's not going anywhere. Now here's the thing I'm curious about, because I've gone back and forth on this myself more times than I can count. Was I right to push back the way I did, knowing it would cost the HOA money, knowing my neighbors would end up paying for a decision they didn't all agree with? Or should I have just cut the tree, avoided the conflict, and kept the peace? I want to hear what you think. Would you have done the same thing, or handled it differently? Let me know in the comments, because situations like this, they're never as simple as they look from the outside.